Atom Air Flight 574, Key 574 or DHI 574, was a scheduled domestic passenger flight operated by Atom Air between the Indonesian cities of Surabaya and Manado. The aircraft involved was a Boeing 737-4Q8 with serial number 24070, registration PKKK, which was manufactured in 1989 and was acquired by Atom Air in November 2005. The plane was equipped with two CFM56-3C1 engines, had around 50,000 hours flying, and was last evaluated and declared airworthy by the Indonesian Transport Ministry on the 25th of December 2005. Captain was Refry Agustian Widodo, 46-year-old, who joined Atom Air in 2006. The first officer was 36-year-old Yoga Susanto. Captain Widodo was a seasoned veteran, having logged more than 13,300 hours of flying time. As pilot in command of Boeing 737 aircraft, he had more than 3,800 hours of experience. First Officer Susanto had 4,200 total flying hours and he had almost 1,000 hours logged as a Boeing 737 First Officer. On the 1st of January 2007, at around 1300 local time, 6 o'clock Coordinated Universal Time, the plane departed from Wanda Airport, Surabaya, with 96 passengers, 85 adults, 7 children and 4 infants, a 56% load factor, and 6 crew on board. The passenger list was composed mainly of Indonesian nationals and a majority of passengers were returning to Manado after New Year's Day. The foreigners were an American family of 3. The 2-hour flight, scheduled to arrive at Samratulangi Airport, Manado, at 1600 local time. Problems started when the pilots noticed an anomaly in the Inertial Reference System, IRS. The first officer then attempted to troubleshoot, resetting his IRS unit by switching the knob on his side to AT mode. This blanked out his attitude indicator, effectively making it the captain's responsibility to fly the plane straight and level for 30 seconds as the realignment process is completed. The captain did not do this. As a result of his fixation on the faulty IRS, he did not fly the aircraft, and previous maintenance issues involving the aircraft's ailerons caused the airplane to gradually roll slowly to the right. When the aircraft reached 35 degrees right bank, and increasing, a bank angle, audible warning sounded in the cockpit. In a panic, Captain Widodo told the first officer to switch the IRS mode back to nav, to hopefully reverse the situation they got themselves into. Now that the first officer's attitude indicator had returned to its normal state, First Officer Susanto could see that the aircraft was in a dangerous position and attempted to notify the captain. When this failed, he then tried to recover the aircraft from its descent by turning the yoke to the left. Believing that the aircraft was flying straight and level, Captain Widodo then unknowingly reminded First Officer Susanto that the aircraft needed to fly straight and level in order to complete the IRS alignment process. The aircraft now was in a 100-degree bank with a 60-degree nose-down attitude. First Officer Susanto successfully notified the captain of their situation. In response to the first officer telling him to pull up to stop the rapid descent towards the sea, Captain Widodo pulled back on his yoke, and the aircraft, traveling over 90% of the speed of sound, began to break apart in flight. All recordings stopped at 9,000 feet, presumably because the aircraft had fully broken apart. All 102 people on board died, making it the deadliest aviation accident involving a Boeing 737-400. A national investigation was launched into the disaster. The final report, released on the 25th of March 2008, concluded that the pilots lost control of the aircraft after they became preoccupied with troubleshooting the inertial navigation system and inadvertently disconnected the autopilot.
Flight 101 was a suggested Air India passenger flight from Mumbai to London via Delhi, Beirut, and Geneva. On morning of January 24, 1966, at 8 o'clock 2 minutes CET, on approach to Geneva, the Boeing 747 operating the flight accidentally flew into Mont Blanc in France. 15 years before, another was Air India Flight 245 flight to London Heathrow crashed into almost the same flying pod. Air India 245 was a charter service carrying 48 passengers from Mumbai in November 1915 using a Lockheed Constellation, displaying registers VTCQP and known as the Malabar Princess, crashed on approach to Geneva. All 48 on board were killed and only a few items were recovered. The Boeing 707-437 VTDMN has first flown on 5 April 1961 and was delivered new to Air India on 25 May 1961. It has flown a total of 16,188 hours. It was named Kanchenjunga, another high mountain in India. Air India Flight 101 was a suggested flight from Mumbai to London, and on the day of the accident, it was operated by a Boeing 707. Designation VTDMN. The captain, Joe T. D. Souza, was an 18-year veteran. After leaving Mumbai, it made two suggested stops, Delhi and Beirut, and was enrolled to another stop at Geneva. Thank you for watching the video. If you have idea of a run, please comment below to everyone discuss.
Rotate. Positive brake. Gear up.
At 19,000 feet, 5,800 meters, the crew was entrusted to descend to Geneva International Airport after the aircraft passed Mont Blanc. The pilot, thinking he had passed Mont Blanc, starting to descend and flew into Mont Blanc massif in France near the Rocher de la Tourente at an elevation of 4,750 meters, 15,584 feet.
Sink rate. Sink rate. Hold up. Sink rate. Sink. Hold up. Sink rate. Sink rate. Hold up. Sink rate. Hold. Hold. Hold up.
All 106 passengers and 11 crew were killed. Among the victims was third Dr. Homi Jarin Baba, the founder and chairman of Atomic Energy Commission of India. The task of recovering remains, aircraft parts, and another cargo at over 15,000 feet was not an easy one. Bad weather at the summit means that rescue attempts can be called off frequently, and the wreckage of the 707s remains a laterally even today. The investigations conclude the pilot in command calculated his position to relation to Mont Blanc and report his own estimate of this position to the controller. The radar controller knows a different position of aircraft has a communication to the aircraft which will enable to change its position. The pilot too under the mistaken impression that he passed the ridge leader to the summit and was still flight level, which offers the safety clearance to the top of Mont Blanc. Continue his descent. Descent discoveries. Much of the wreckage of the crash Boeing still remains at the crash site. In 2008, a climber found some Indian newspaper dates 23 January 1966. An engine from Air India Flight 245, which had crashed military at the same spot 16 years earlier, 1915, was also discovered. On 21 August 2010, a 9-kilogram juice bag of a diplomatic mail stamp. In September 2013, a French airlines found a metal box marked with the Air India logo at the site of plane crash on Mont Blanc, containing rubies, sapphires, and emeralds, valued over €245,000.
Flash Airlines Flight 604 was a charter flight from Sharm el-Sheikh International Airport in Egypt to Charles de Gaulle International Airport in Paris, France, with a stopover at Cairo International Airport, provided by Egyptian private charter company Flash Airlines. On the 3rd of January 2004, the Boeing 737-300 that was operating the route crashed into the Red Sea shortly after takeoff from Sharm el-Sheikh International Airport, killing all 135 passengers, most of whom were French tourists, and all 13 crew members. The findings of the crash investigation were controversial, with accident investigators from the different countries involved unable to agree on the cause of the accident. The aircraft involved in the accident was an 11-year-old Boeing 737-3Q8 powered by two CFM56-3C1 engines. At the time of the accident, it had accumulated 25,600 flight hours and 18,000 cycles of takeoffs and landings. The captain of Flight 604 was 53-year-old Qadir Abdullah. He was a highly respected pilot who had accrued almost 7,500 hours of flight time, including 474 hours on the Boeing 737. The first officer was 25-year-old Amr al-Shafi, who had fewer than 800 hours of flying experience, with 242 of on the Boeing 737. 42-year-old Ashraf Abdul Hamid, who was training as a first officer and had experience flying corporate jets, sat in the cockpit with the pilot and co-pilot. Though Egyptian, Abdul Hamid also held Canadian and U.S. citizenships. Most of the passengers aboard the flight were French tourists from the Paris metropolitan area. A provisional passenger list, dated the 5th of January 2004, stated that 12 entire French families had boarded the flight. The aircraft departed from Sharm el-Sheikh International Airport at 4:42 Eastern Europe Time, 2:42 Coordinated Universal Time, on the 3rd of January 2004. After taking off, it made a left turn to intercept the airport's VOR system, and the autopilot was then engaged. Shortly afterwards, however, Captain Abdullah made an unintelligible exclamation and the autopilot abruptly disconnected. This might have been an intentional action by the pilots, or it may have happened automatically. At this point the aircraft entered a right bank of 40 degrees. When the bank reached 50 degrees, First Officer al-Shafi called out "overbank," indicating that the aircraft's bank was becoming dangerous. The bank angle increased rapidly until it reached 111 degrees, at which point the aircraft entered a stall. It crashed into the Red Sea at 4:45 Eastern Europe Time, 2:45 Coordinated Universal Time, just 3 minutes after takeoff. At a speed of 412 knots at a right bank angle of 24 degrees and at a nose-down angle of 24 degrees. The tail broke off of the plane and rolled forward after the crash into the sea. All 148 people on board perished. The wreckage sank to a depth of 3,300 feet, making recovery of the flight data recorder, FDR, and cockpit voice recorder, CVR, difficult. However, 2 weeks after the accident, both devices were located by a French salvage vessel and recovered by a ROV. The accident investigators examined the recorders while in Cairo. The maintenance records of the aircraft had not been duplicated. They were destroyed in the crash and no backup copies existed. The Ministry of Civil Aviation, MCA, investigated the accident. With assistance from the American National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, and the French Bureau of Enquiry and Analysis for Civil Aviation Safety, B. The NTSB and the B concluded that the pilot suffered spatial disorientation and the co-pilot was unwilling to challenge his more experienced superior. Furthermore, according to the NTSB and B, both officers were insufficiently trained. The NTSB stated that the cockpit voice recorder showed that 24 seconds passed after the airliner banked before the pilot began corrective maneuvers.
Sink rate, pull up. Sink rate, pull up. Sink rate, pull up. Don't sink.
Kenya Airways Flight 431 was an international scheduled Abidjan, Lagos, Nairobi passenger service operated by Kenyan national airline Kenya Airways. On January 30, 2000, the Airbus A310-300 serving the flight crashed into the sea off the Ivory Coast, shortly after takeoff from Félix Houphouët-Boigny International Airport, Abidjan. There were 179 people on board, of whom 169 were passengers and 10 crew. The aircraft involved in the accident was an Airbus A310-304, registration 5Y Bent. The aircraft had logged 58,115 flight hours at the time of the accident. It was powered by two GECF6-80C2A2 turbofan engines. The port and starboard engine serial numbers were 690,120 and 690,141, respectively. Before the crash, they had accumulated 43,635 and 41,754 flight hours, respectively. The flight was commanded by 44-year-old Captain Paul Muthy, an experienced officer who had logged 11,636 flying hours at the time of the accident, including 1,664 hours on the Airbus A310. He qualified as an A310 pilot on August 10, 1986, and also held ratings for Boeing 737-300, Boeing 737-200, Fokker 50 and Fokker 27, as well as various small aircraft. The first officer was 43-year-old Lazaro Mutumbai Mully, who had 7,295 hours of flight time, with 5,768 of them on the Airbus A310. First Officer Mully was the pilot flying on the accident flight. After a 3-hour layover, the aircraft took off for Lagos at 21:08 Greenwich Mean Time.
Positive right. Gear up.
However, just seconds after takeoff, at the moment when the first officer requested the landing gear to be retracted, the stall warning sounded in the cockpit. In response, the crew put the aircraft into a controlled descent. The first officer told the captain to silence the stall warning. The Ground Proximity Warning System, GPWS, then sounded briefly, though the radio altimeter sent out warnings seconds after, cutting off the GPWS warning. The master warning then sounded, indicating that the aircraft was overspeeding, at which point Captain Muthy shouted, "Go up!" But the aircraft was descending too quickly to recover.
Don't sink, too low, terrain. Don't sink, too low, terrain. Don't sink, too low, terrain. Sink rate, pull up. Sink rate, pull up. Sink rate, pull up. Sink rate, pull up. Don't sink, too...
The aircraft crashed into the Atlantic Ocean, 2 kilometers, 1.2 miles, east of the airport, off the Ivory Coast. The airframe was completely destroyed by the impact. There were 169 casualties out of 179 people on board the aircraft. Most of the passengers and crew were reported to be Nigerians. 2 of the crew members on board worked for KLM. The 168 people who lost their lives whose nationalities are known came from 33 countries. The nationality of one additional deceased victim was not determined. The crash was the deadliest involving the Airbus A310 and the deadliest in Ivory Coast history. It was the first fatal crash for Kenya Airways as well as the deadliest. Search and rescue operations were conducted immediately. An alert was issued to Ivory Coast Air Force, Ivory Coast Fire and Rescue Service, airport officials and French gendarmerie stationed at the airport. The nighttime condition was described as very dark and the presence of fog further hampered the search and rescue efforts. Strong currents in the area also posed risks to divers and rescue personnel. Rescue personnel also had to take detour to the crash site due to the absence of a quay near the runway. The aerial search had to be suspended due to the inclement weather condition. According to Samuel Egbe, a Nigerian survivor, there were lots of screams at the crash site just minutes after the crash. This was also corroborated by testimony from other Nigerian survivor, Francis Kajindaba Sambo. Few hours later, the screams died out. The search and rescue continued until the noon of January 31st, after authorities reported no chance of finding any more people. In total, 12 survivors had been rescued from the crash site. A total of 70 bodies had also been recovered from the crash site. The recovery operation lasted from February 1st to March 2nd. Search and rescue personnel managed to recover 146 bodies, while 23 bodies were missing. During the operation, a Kenyan diver drowned while trying to recover the victims. An investigation was carried out by the French BEA. It concluded that the crash was caused by the flight crew's improper response following the activation of a false stall warning. In the aftermath of the crash, the BEA issued recommendations for better training for pilots in terms of handling a false stall warning. During the course of the investigation, BEA had also learned of new stall recovery procedure, stating that such procedure would be included in future flight operation manuals. The following elements contributed to the accident. The pilot flying's action on the control column put the airplane into a descent without the crew realizing it, despite the radio altimeter callouts. The GPWS warnings that could have alerted the crew to an imminent contact with the sea were masked by the priority stall and overspeed warnings, in accordance with the rules on the prioritization of warnings. The conditions for a takeoff performed towards the sea and at night provided no external visual references that would have allowed the crew to be aware of the direct proximity of the sea.
Ukraine International Airlines Flight 752 was a scheduled international civilian passenger flight from Tehran to Kyiv, operated by Ukraine International Airlines. On the 8th of January 2020, the Boeing 737-800 flying the route was shot down by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC, shortly after takeoff. The aircraft was a Boeing 737-8 kV, serial number 38124. Registration PSR. It was 3.5 years old when it was shot down, having first flown on the 21st of June 2016. It was delivered to UIA on the 19th of July 2016. The aircraft was well maintained, with the airline saying it had been inspected just 2 days before the crash. The flight was operated by Ukraine International Airlines, flag carrier and largest airline of Ukraine. On a scheduled flight from Iranian capital Tehran's Imam Khomeini International Airport to Boryspil International Airport in the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv, the aircraft was carrying 176 people, including 9 crew members and 15 children. In addition to 6 flight attendants, the crew consisted of Captain Volodymyr Gapanenko, 11,600 hours on Boeing 737 aircraft, including 5,500 hours as captain, instructor pilot Oleksiy Nomkin 12,000 hours on Boeing 737s, including 6,600 as captain, and First Officer Serhiy Komenko 7,600 hours on Boeing 737.
Flights.
Flight 752 took off from runway 29R an hour behind schedule, at 6 hours 12 minutes and 8 seconds local time, UTC plus 3:30, and was expected to land in Kyiv at 8 o'clock local time, UTC plus 2 o'clock. Between 6 hours 14 minutes and 17 seconds and 6 hours 14 minutes and 45 seconds the airplane turned from the takeoff heading of 289 degrees to heading 313 degrees, following its regular route.
Flights.
In response to the Iranian missile attack, the U.S. Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, in a notice to airmen, NOTAM, banned all American civil aircraft from flying over Iran, Iraq, the Gulf of Oman and the Persian Gulf. Although the FAA NOTAMs are not binding on non-U.S. airlines, many airlines take them into consideration when making safety decisions. Especially after the downing of Malaysia Airlines Flight 17 in 2014. Analysis of several videos by the New York Times showed that the aircraft was hit almost immediately by the first of two short-range missiles launched 30 seconds apart by the IRGC. And with the aircraft having maintained its track, by the second missile 23 seconds later, after which it veered right and could be seen on fire before disappearing from view. Ukrainian investigators believe the pilots were killed instantly by shrapnel from the missile which exploded near the cockpit. However, an analysis of the cockpit voice recorder indicated that for at least 19 seconds after the first missile strike, all three cockpit crew members continued to attempt to fly the aircraft. And there was no indication of injury or adverse health effects during that time.
Sink rate. Sink rate. Pull. Sink rate. Pull. Sink rate. Sink rate. Sink rate. Pull up. Sink rate. Sink rate. Pull up. Sink.
All 176 passengers and crew were killed. Iran 82, Canada 63, Ukraine 11, Sweden 10, Afghanistan 7, United Kingdom 3. It is the deadliest flight in terms of fatalities involving the Boeing 737 next generation fleet, and the second deadliest of the entire Boeing 737 family behind Lion Air Flight 610. Shortly after the crash, emergency responders arrived in 22 ambulances, 4 bus ambulances, and a helicopter, but intense fires prevented a rescue attempt. The wreckage was strewn over a wide area. With no survivors found at the crash site, the aircraft was completely destroyed on impact. Iranian authorities initially denied having any responsibility for the aircraft's destruction, but investigations by various intelligence agencies from the Western world as well as by the Iranian public later revealed that it had been struck by 2 surface-to-air missiles. On the 11th of January, Iran admitted it had shot down the Ukrainian jet by accident, the result of human error. General Amir Ali Hajizadeh, the head of the IRGC's Aerospace Force, said his unit accepts full responsibility for the shootdown. In an address broadcast by state television, he said that when he learned about the downing of the airplane, "I wished I was dead." Hajizadeh said that, with his forces on high alert, an officer mistook it for a hostile missile and made a bad decision.
Thank you for watching the video. If you have an idea of a flag, please comment below to everyone discuss.